Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to attend this webinar where we'll be exploring anime, manga, light novels, and some of the different storytelling methods of these formats. When I was first putting this webinar together, I had to ask myself these questions. Is there a need for something like this for libraries? Everyone has a basic sense of what anime, manga, and light novels are, don't they? And is this too broad of a topic? Finally, does anyone really care? Now, maybe I didn't answer all of these in our talk today, but what I could and did focus most of this webinar around is the ways in which stories are constructed, shared, accepted, and discovered, with the hope that this will be beneficial for all of us as librarians, and also to expand our diverse resources that we can share with our patrons. When considering anime, it's best to think of this as a broad category. Many times people who are trying to wrap their heads around what anime and manga are, they get a bit hung up on the visuals, the animated aspect, the drawn aspects, and just categorize it as a genre. It's easiest, really, to think of it as a format or a vehicle creators use to best deliver the story that he or she wants to tell. Films have genres, and so too does anime, which makes trying to discuss and have an inclusive talk about anime just a bit daunting, because it's similar to trying to discuss storytelling through film and cinema or graphic novels. It's a huge body of work. Essentially what we're going to be doing here today, as anime is basically just animated works from Japan, is moving through the different stories, going through some of the different formats, the anime, the light novels, the mangas, the live action films, and we can categorize these as ways in which stories are told rather than trying to find equivalent counterparts in Western media. With that in mind, we have to recognize that globally, still, as well as moving images, are increasingly prominent as carriers of meaning, and writing is being displaced by image as the central mode for representation. Now, I vacillated on whether or not to include a quote like this to help situate this discussion, as it's a bit uncomfortable for a librarian to consider this quote. But as we move through these different stories today, I think we'll realize that there is very much room for all methods of storytelling. However, we do need to acknowledge that visual media plays a huge and significant role in modern storytelling and popular culture. Stories, and with all these images and different media, we are just attempting to tell stories. So stories are the way in which our minds make sense of our lives and world. We work at understanding events and people by constructing stories to interpret what is occurring around us. In turn, these stories create our views of the world and the lens through which we construct meaning about ourselves and others. We also tell stories to make connections, form relationships, and create community with others. These stories provide a way for us to move between local and global cultures and to explore the ways in which people live and think in cultures that are different from our own, which is especially important when considering anime, manga, and Japanese media and storytelling methods, as we're importing them into our own culture and trying to make sense in the same way that the mangaka and the creators are making sense of the world in which they live through these different mediums for telling stories. Again, stories help us to make sense of the world. The methods may vary, but the themes are the same. We use stories to capture our hopes, our fears, dreams, desires, adventures. Stories help us examine the past, who we are today, and they really offer a space to speculate about the future and even create alternative realities. So the ways in which we create and tell stories are culturally based. Our human need to story our experiences may be universal. There's no one way to tell stories, which is a key component to understanding the appeal of manga and anime, because they're mediums for telling a story. There's no rule mandating that stories need to be told in print format or live action. A well-told story is captivating regardless of the format in which it is presented. So let's dive into some of these stories. And look, it's not just quotes. There are visuals, which is basically the key ingredient of manga and anime. So please bear in mind that these images are in no particular order. It's a huge smattering, a sampling of manga covers, and shouldn't be taken as top choices or best and worst. These are just some of the more popular titles. I did try to avoid making equivalencies, searching for equal counterparts when trying to contextualize these works. for our understanding here in the United States, but it's a bit difficult to avoid drawing comparisons in order to understand how these materials are received here. Susan J. Napier helped explain this through her perception of manga in her 2003 article, The Problem of Existence in Japanese Animation. She said that manga are often described as comic books, but they are quite different from what Americans would think of as comic books. More like graphic novels, they are thick, sometimes telephone book sized, and they are, volumes which depict anything and everything from mystery stories to etiquette lessons, and are read by almost all of the Japanese population from childhood through at least middle age, which, though I said I wasn't going to draw comparisons, it does differ in the way that Western comic book and graphic novels are perceived, though they're gaining ground and legitimacy in academia and in popular culture. We do have a tendency in the United States to classify them as for young adults, boys who live in the basement, and a certain particular group within society. They're gaining ground, especially through live-action films, but there is definitely a cultural difference and significance of manga and print media and storytelling in Japan. And in a recent interview, Ichiya Nakamura, who's a professor at Keio University, expressed that manga actually accounts for 40% of Japanese publications. It's read by adults and children alike, and he considers it a deep culture involving a wide range of generations. He's expressed that diversity is one of the biggest characteristics of manga overall, which via the images on the screen you can see these cover a lot of different genres, stories, age groups. So how do we classify it? And as librarians, we're very big on classification, and we know the importance of age-appropriate materials and the roles these play in collection development. So these are your basic labels. While there are many, many genres, the bulk of them fall into these 4 classifications, and they're meant to indicate age and demographic more so than the type of genre. There can be science fiction stories in any of these categories, but it's the level to which they are geared. So shonen comics are generally aimed at young male audiences, considered boys comics. These are seen as generally for pre-adolescent, adolescent boys, but they're not just for boys. These manga are consistently the ones that see the most crossover in age and gender demographics. These are basically your hero stories. Again, not trying to draw too many equivalents, but these would be like your DC Marvel equivalents as far as heroic journeys, central characters that revolve around encountering a new world, developing skill sets, having battles, fantastical situations, and the need to navigate new worlds or require new skills to survive and succeed in the new world they've encountered. Notable examples, as you can see from the screen, are Bleach, Sword Art Online, and Naruto, including Fairy Tail and one of the longest running manga, One Piece. And they're basically the boys' anime, but as I've said, Viz Media and Shonen Jump have really made a huge push for these to be widely accepted, and like the hero movies that we have in the United States, they are gaining ground in young adult females, middle age. They're read by a broad audience as compared to some of the other categories we're going to be going through. So shojo are the equivalent to shonen, and these are the ones that are aimed at female audiences. They're for young girls. Typically age 10 to 18, they're more of the counterpart to shonen titles. They deal with interpersonal relationships and character development over skill set, battle, and power acquisition. So these will deal with, as I said, interpersonal relationships, romance, as opposed to the more action-oriented stories. Shoujo focus on school life, slice of life, day-to-day adventure. They focus on the inner reflection of generally the heroine and her journey, as well as the journey of her friends. Just like shonen titles, however, shoujo manga spans many genres, including comedy, fantasy, historical, magical girl, and science fiction. Titles include Sailor Moon, as you can see, and Fruits Basket, along with Revolutionary Girl Utena and The Wallflower. So these stories really, they're softer, even the drawings are usually lighter, they incorporate more fashion, as opposed to the shonen manga, which are bloodier, generally have action scenes, a lot more movement. Now, when you get out of adolescence and you're talking about young adults into adulthood, you have Seinen and josei. So Seinen manga are aimed at men. These are comic books for men that typically cross with the tail end of the shonen readership and extend into the adult readership. These tend to be more mature in storyline. They can just be slice of life, but they may in fact have a lot more graphic violence, sexual content. These are titles like Akira, Attack on Titan, although Attack on Titan is tricky because it can technically fall into the shonen classification. Ghost in the Shell, Hellsing, there'll be nudity, again, violence, gore. It's more action-oriented and mature, and the themes are different. You're dealing with self-identity, counterculture, things that are only touched upon in the shonen manga because the focus in shonen is more for young adult action and adventure, and the seinen deals with more of the philosophical concepts into adulthood and dealing with the wider world and possibilities therein. The least sort of popular of the four categories is actually those that are aimed at women. These typically cross, again, with the tail end of the shojo readership, but there aren't as many, and this tends to be because they're not as profitable, they're not as high selling as the other categories. They tend to, again, be more mature in storyline and deal with relationships, but the relationships dealt with in these manga as opposed to shojo are at a higher level. They're more mature in content. They're not the high school-esque atmosphere that's seen in shoujo. The heroine is headed towards a romantic relationship in shoujo, and the end goal is usually getting together with her romantic interest and exploring her feelings. In the josei titles, relationships are not the end game. They're either in existence or the heroine is trying to navigate an established relationship, but the larger portions of the stories deal with adult themes, issues, and milestones. Significant titles in this category are titles like Loveless and Paradise Kiss, but again, these, while popular in these titles, it's not the most popular grouping of the four major categories. And many anime are actually derived from manga series. They're developed out of popular manga titles, and this kind of keeps things simple when determining categories for collection development, because whatever it tracks as a manga, it will apply to the series. Anime, as we've said already, is short for animation and is just used to classify animated works in Japan. To touch on anime, because I didn't want to go through the entire history, we don't have enough time, and that's probably a series of 3 or 4 webinars in and of itself. But as mentioned earlier, trying to discuss anime is a bit like trying to discuss the history of film. It's daunting to cover, and we're not going to get through it in 40 minutes. So rather than taking you through decades of history, I just wanted to direct you to the Film Center at Tokyo's National Museum of Modern Art. Their webpage is actually celebrating 100 years of Japanese animated film. Beginning with films like The Dull Sword from 1917, which they credit as the oldest existing Japanese animation, all the way up through 1941, and ending with The Lazy Fox, another short animated piece. Despite enjoying more popularity than ever before and greater exposure through streaming services and inclusion in national conventions in the United States, anime still tends to confuse people. Many still draw comparisons to children's cartoons or misunderstand the imagery and style of anime as childish or strange in appearance. While the US has currently embraced hero movies, Marvel and DC, graphic novel adaptations, these remain safely within the realm of live action films and are therefore more legitimized as being for adults as opposed to the concept of for children because it's a cartoon. So Susan Napier's earlier article that I mentioned examined the Westerners' seeming unease with these animated works, and she said that when we watch a live action film, we have certain expectations that actions will progress in a, quote, normal format. For example, if a ball is thrown, we expect that it's going to follow a reasonable trajectory from one end of the room to the other and then maybe bounce back. In animation, doesn't necessarily happen, and there are no guarantees. Just about anything can happen in anime and usually does. It's one of the greatest aspects of anime as a format for storytelling, since it lends itself to incorporating elements that suspend our expectations of reality and translate fantastical worlds onto the screen in unique ways that aren't possible through other formats. Rather than go through a chronological look at anime from Astro Boy to Attack on Titan, we're going to look at some of the unique genres of anime, a few films, and some of the live action pieces that are coming up through Japan, as well as adaptations that were done of anime in live action in the United States, and understand the myriad resources that are available to include in your own library collections depending on your particular focus and particular patron interests. So films, if we're going to talk about films, I cannot talk about them without mentioning Hayao Miyazaki, who is one of the most well-known and respected filmmakers in Japan. Operating in the anime format, Jonathan Ross interviewed Miyazaki in a 2002 BBC documentary called Japanorama, and he mentioned that Miyazaki has basically been called the Japanese Disney. And as I said before, we try to avoid doing the cross comparisons this way. And in fact, Miyazaki said that he's not very happy to be called the Disney, the Japanese Disney. And he said that Disney is a producer, but he's not a director. My Neighbor Totoro is essentially a story about two sisters discovering forest spirits where they move to the country. Of course, that's just the surface. It's not just a film for childhood. It's a film that explores childhood and explores nature, environment, and environmentalism. But there are no villains, epic challenges, battles, evil spirits hiding with apples and forests that are hallmarks of classic children's films. Totoro asks us to see the world and nature through the perspective of children and recognize the magic and beauty of that perception. A lot of his films actually deal with childhood and innocence when interactions within the world, environmentalism, and nature. Princess Mononoke is a class example of this, and it was released in 1997 as a record-breaking film in Japan that grossed over $150 million. It's a sophisticated film that explores the environmental theme of man versus nature and the natural order of the world. And again, there are no cut and dry villains, and the central character's motivations throughout the film, his motivation is to find a cure for a fatal wound he's received, but not to fight an epic battle with the central villain, because there is no central villain. While it was exported to the United States, it's actually the first Studio Ghibli film to have been exported here, but it didn't achieve the same success as it had in Japan. And Miyazaki felt that was in part due to the lack of understanding in the United States of cartoon and animation as a format and medium for adults. And he said he didn't expect children to fully understand Princess Mononoke and was surprised when they did. And it was in fact the adults and the critics who were confused. Moving on to another, he has over 30 films, and I'm not going to go through all of them. But Howl's Moving Castle is a good exemplar because of the interplay and cultural exchange that happens in the storytelling and creation of this film. As with many art forms, inspiration from literature and print materials happens when we're translating to film. And in the case of Howl's Moving Castle, Miyazaki based it on Diana Wynne Jones' novel of the same name. The film can certainly be enjoyed by children. It's colorful, it's imaginative, it's lighthearted, but we're dealing with a film that has overarching themes that are relevant to adults and should be recognized for the strength of its characters and story, rather than just categorized exclusively as an animated feature. It deals with old age, isolation, and whether his films are dealing with soot sprites or fire demons, inquisitive children or princesses, Miyazaki's characters are always multidimensional, and he's a master storyteller and world builder. So as we return to the theme of storytelling that's sort of driving the talk, and the framework for evaluating these stories and works and pieces, rather than focusing on them as just animation, I do have to mention that these are only a few of his works, and as I said, there are over 30 of them, including the 2003 Oscar-winning Spirited Away. I would encourage any librarians, public, academic, to acquire as many of his films as possible for your collection, because they are essential to any core collection that you're trying to develop dealing with anime, Japanese culture, or film studies. As mentioned before, there are quite a few anime films that should be considered for core titles in any anime collection, and while I am trying to touch on a portion of them here, Please note that this is not going to be an exhaustive list, so I'm not going to hit on every one that you might consider core, but I cannot talk about Japanese animation without at least mentioning Akira. Released in 1988, Akira remains a highly influential film and has an enduring legacy as part of the cultural exchange of art. It actually breached genres, and Kim Newman from Empire magazine basically said it when she wrote that, simply put, no Akira, no Matrix. It's that important. Which is essentially true of another classic film which you may have seen crossing your commercials on TV for Ghost in the Shell, which was an animated film that's been adapted to a live action. A really nice piece you might have already seen in your libraries that explains the cross-cultural connections and influences and the exchange of ideas when dealing with anime films translated to live action and the cross-cultural exchange between is Scrolls to Screen, A Brief History of Anime. This is actually a 22-minute documentary that was included on the Animatrix DVD that was released in that same year. When developing The Matrix, the Wachowskis basically went to the studio and said, we want to do this, but with real people. And as you watch The Matrix, if you've seen Akira or Ghost in the Shell, you'll recognize immediately that many of the camera angles, body movements, and overall cinematography reflect the anime films. And one of the commentators in the documentary actually remarks that it seemed like they were animating the actors. Akira and Ghost in the Shell are definitely geared towards adults. These are not films that I would recommend you allow small children to check out. They are seminal works in anime, but they also bridged into the science fiction genre. Not all animated films are dealing with these heavy topics: the search for identity, artificial intelligence, examination of humanity, and the possibility of loss of our humanity. But anime covers a broad target audience. And in films, we've seen there are multiple genres, and through the manga classifications we just went through, these aren't all themes that are for kids. So I can't drive home enough that we do still have that misunderstanding here. And I keep emphasizing that based off a recent experience actually with the other two films you see on the screen. So 5 centimeters per second and your name actually just came out, and if you're lucky enough in your area, you might still be able to catch it in theaters. They're both from Makoto Shinkai. Your Name, if you have the opportunity to go and see it, I cannot encourage you enough to run, not walk, drive, but don't break the speed limit, and get to the theaters to watch this. It's actually broken previous records held by the previously mentioned film, Miyazaki film Spirited Away. In a twist of fate, I had no idea this movie was going to come out, but a colleague who knows of my interests and who is similarly interested in graphic novels, anime, and manga in higher education was discussing her plans in a meeting. And long story short, I saw an image on her laptop and I said, that looks really similar to 5 centimeters per second, which is an excellent film dealing with relationships and identity and coming of age. And lo and behold, it was from the same director, which as you examine animation and anime films, you'll notice that a lot of directors have particular styles and the drawings are stylized, so you can begin to recognize patterns in the work. Your Name deals with time travel. It's reminiscent of magical realism without losing its real-world grounding in modern sensibilities. A number of Japanese films address these concepts, especially those from Studio Ghibli, which houses Miyazaki's films. They grapple with the theme of Japan's traditional cultural practices intersecting with modern society and the increase of technology sort of saturating lives. So all I can say without spoiling this for anyone was when my colleague and I exited the theater with misty eyes, mind you, all we said to each other was, that was so good, multiple times. So we had a more articulate discussion later, and without spoiling it, the story is basically imaginative and relatable and really appealing for young adults in the United States as well as Japan. So it's very exciting that it's broken previous records and achieved popularity in our current society right now. And as I said, it's still out in theaters, so catch it if you can. It's kind of going to wrap up films, and I'm going to touch on more later because there are films that came before manga, manga that came before anime series that were created without manga. So we're going to go back and forth a little bit. But getting into anime series, if I can't talk about film without Miyazaki, I can't talk about animated and anime series without discussing Cowboy Bebop. So animated series and anime make up a large portion of the entire content delivery storytelling format in Japan. So Cowboy Bebop was broadcast in the United States in the early 2000s on Adult Swim, and it's actually one of the anime I recommend to a lot of young adults and adults who've never watched anime before or have little experience. Watanabe has referred to it as a new genre unto itself, and that's fairly accurate. Cowboy Bebop actually blends a variety of genres: action films, film noir, spaghetti western, science fiction, and because of that, the way the story is told and the themes, which are pretty high-level themes and philosophical concepts like existentialism and loneliness, they're explored through the storytelling format and visual means without intimidating people who've never experienced anime before. So there are themes and plots that appeal to lovers of sci-fi, film noir, and action titles who may not actually have watched anime. And part of what makes this so unique and accessible is the ability to bridge the genres, and Cowboy Bebop, basically, there was a lot of free reign in developing the story. In a 2013 interview, he acknowledged that Bandai's toy division basically told him his only requirement was to have a spaceship. And when they saw the adult nature of the show, it became apparent that this is not going to sell spaceships. So fortunately, Bandai Visual picked it up, and he envisioned it as a movie and not a series. So each episode, which they're actually called sessions, was designed as sort of a mini film, which is very appealing when you're trying to sell people on anime, because you don't necessarily have to watch the entire series, and they get a taste of what an adult story in an animated form is like. And currently, if you check out IMDb's top-rated TV shows, Cowboy Bebop is number 31 out of the top 50. So if you have patrons who are a little nervous, they say they don't like anime, they're weird looking, they don't watch cartoons, just keep this in your back pocket as something to tempt them into watching. Along with the series, there was a movie. It's set between some of the sessions, the later sessions, or episodes, and the series was also adapted into a manga. In 2003 and 2004, it was released here, and they're side stories, not summations of the title itself. Also from Shinichiro Watanabe is another series, again for young adults and adults, that I would recommend as part of any core collection, is another kind of mix-up. It's called Samurai Champloo. It developed independently of any prior manga series. There were no light novels before it, and it's a mix of genres that are blended together into a powerful storyline that explores philosophical concepts, familial relationships, religion, sexuality, and rather than using cowboys and jazz, this series blends hip-hop and samurai. So Shinichiro Watanabe expressed that he had more liberties with this show than he did Bebop, and he noticed that since there was no toys and merchandising, he pretty much had free reign to explore whatever concepts he wanted to. So it's a character-driven show, and in both cases he expressed that the first thing that occurs to him is the characters, and he tries to build stories around them. So again, most of these stories are very, very character-driven. They're not just for kids and not cartoons. And as I mentioned, Samurai Champloo is one that started as a concept for anime, and a manga came later. So there's only a 2-volume manga that goes with Samurai Champloo that basically are side pieces to the overall story. Now, I didn't want to go through too many of the big shonen and shojo anime because I wanted to get into some of the lesser known ones. So because there are so many different genres, I wanted to take a minute to go through the horror anime. I am not a fan of horror. I don't watch horror movies. I pretty much hate horror, but I wanted to put it out there as something that is not ninjas, samurais, heroes, or perhaps magical girls. It's a genre people don't always consider as one that would be in cartoons or animated pieces, which, not true. These are definitely horror stories, and they create a pretty spooky atmosphere. There's blood, there's fear, there's gore. They're definitely mature in content, so keep that in mind when acquiring these for your library collection. And remember that just because it's animated doesn't mean it's safe for everyone. So Hellsing is basically your average story about battling the undead, hunting vampires, supernatural creatures. There are no sparkly or glittery vampires. These are serious, aggressive vampires. There's blood. Serial Experiment Lane explores technology, reality, and the merging of these and the impact on identity. Could you lose your own mind without being conscious of it? Hellgirl is a pretty tricky one. It explores how far people are willing to go to get revenge on others and what they would exchange of themselves in order to do so. Another is an anime that's set in middle school. Not for middle schoolers, just happens to be set there. This series involves a lot of mysterious deaths, dark secrets, and mysteries that are threaded throughout the short 12-episode run. On a lighter note, there's sports anime. So in storytelling, sports anime tends to bridge the classifications and can be enjoyed by just about anyone. No blood and guts here. So there are generally character-driven stories. They focus on the interactions and the self-development of the central characters. Many times the central character is learning the skills necessary for the sport because he or she didn't start playing at an early age. They might discover a hidden talent. Personal development and self-awareness. The storylines often showcase their journey towards success, teamwork, and the goals they have in learning to work together. There aren't really any bad guys or villains, which is nice, and there's no swords or magic. It's much closer to slicer life, which makes these stories very relatable. There are definite rivalries. There are usually rival schools or competitive relationships between the characters, but they tend to be character-driven and personalities that are influenced by the type of sports they're playing. Another nice feature of these animes is that you don't actually have to be a fan of the sports or an athlete to appreciate them. They don't focus on professional level athletics, and they often take place in high school settings. So I've recommended sports anime increasingly over the last few years as something that can be a gateway into anime. They're not just geared towards boys, and I can confidently say that it's not true, and I'll confess that sports anime have made me cry. Yes, there were real tears and emotions involved in watching these stories. They're not just about the sport. They're very much character-driven stories. And one of the earliest sports manga, which I don't have pictured on the screen, is actually Captain Tsubasa, which focuses on soccer. And it's a highly popular series that started in the 1980s, produced a large volume of manga, several films, and an anime series that ran from 2001 to 2002. Other popular sports anime include those on the screen: Ace of Diamond, which you can see is baseball, Ice Shield 21, Free, Kuroko's Basketball, Prince of Tennis, Slam Dunk, and Yuri on Ice, which got its own slide because it's very recently released. It came out in 2016, and the second season is coming out in 2017. And it's significant because it actually focuses on figure skating and follows similar patterns to the other sports anime as being character-driven and exploring interpersonal relationships. But it's received quite a bit of attention due to the anxiety, self-esteem, and mental health issues that are explored through the main character Yuri, as well as the portrayal of his relationship with another main character. It drew focus because it's a same-sex relationship within a sports anime. Moving on. So as we move out of anime and into light novels are probably the least known or least explored of the exports from Japan related to anime and manga. A lot of anime is inspired and adapted from manga, but a number of anime have actually been developed straight from light novels. These are often young adult stories. They vary in length more than a novella, but sometimes a little less than a novel, sometimes multi-volume, actually many times multi-volume. And a number of popular anime actually began as light novels and not manga. Moribito is a fantasy story blending feudal Japan and China, and she is a wandering warrior who's basically out to atone for sins of her past. Durarara and Sword Art Online are two pretty popular anime that have come out in recent years that began as light novel series. Spice and Wolf Asuna Hasekura, who was at New York Comic Con this year, was actually questioned on why he set his story in what appears to be medieval Europe. It's a story about a traveling merchant who encounters a harvest goddess. And he said that basically Japanese civilization to him isn't as flashy or showy. He didn't feel like it would be really inspirational. He wanted to look at medieval Europe and swords and blade work and wizardry and dragons. And for him, Japanese history was just too close, and he felt like he knew all the facts and there wasn't enough to explore. Free, which I mentioned as a sports anime, this is the one that made me cry. It's a popular anime series developed from a light novel series called High Speed. High Speed is the one in the top right, and Free is the anime picture in the bottom right. It basically, I remember passing it at a con and I thought, okay, this is basically an excuse to put bishonen or incredibly handsome boys in form-fitting swimsuits, which isn't a bad thing, but it didn't seem like there would be a lot of plot. And I was wrong. I was really wrong. It has a lot of character development, long-lost friendships, team building, rivalries, and a really great story. So if you have patrons that are leery of crossing over genres, I wholeheartedly encourage you to recommend alternative genres like the sports anime, and direct them to light novels if they're considering getting their toe wet in anime but want a basis for doing so. So live action. Live action has been kicking up. Ghost in the Shell was just released a few weeks ago. I didn't see it, so I can't comment. But we have ones that are being released in Japan that are coming as exports here, and then there are some that are being adapted by large movie studios in the United States. Upcoming, Attack on Titan is already out. Upcoming are Full Metal Alchemist and Blade of the Immortal, which are pictured to the right. And there are examples of Western adaptations that didn't do so well, one being Dragon Ball. The series, the animated series on the left, 1989 to 1996, was not successfully adapted into a live-action film with Dragon Ball Evolution 2009. I can confidently say it was not a financial success, and it was not a success with those of us who are fans of anime in translating it to a live action. One that is a success is Rurouni Kenshin, an incredibly popular series, incredibly popular manga, beautifully drawn, gorgeous storyline, characters. It's one of the top, I would say, 20 that comes up on lists whenever people create lists for top anime, top manga, favorite stories related to Japanese storytelling. It was adapted into 3 live-action films, the first of which came out in 2012. So if you are looking for live action to incorporate into your collections and recommend to patrons who want to check them out, I would highly recommend Kenshin as one to start as an incredibly successful adaptation of an anime or manga into live action. Another interesting one, which is based on a Japanese manga of the same name, is Oldboy, which was adapted into a Korean film and won the Cannes Film Festival Grand Prix Award, which actually I think the key judge there was Quentin Tarantino, which makes sense because Oldboy has a bit of a quirky, violent style. It blends film noir, mystery, and thriller aspects. So it's another one I would recommend putting into your collection, but again, not for kids. So getting into using anime in higher ed, Grave of the Fireflies is probably one of the most significant pieces. It's an anime film, and it's post-World War II that follows children that are made homeless by the bombing after the Second World War, and the film basically follows a brother and sister who are displaced, and one of the greatest critiques actually came from Ernest Rister, who compared it to Schindler's List as one of the most profoundly human stories through animated film. So this is a really great one for if you are in higher education or have interactions with teachers that are looking for alternative ways to make sense of war and impact and addressing issues of sort of the aftermath of war and history. This is a really great film for introducing them into anime and getting sort of a neutral space to explore higher level themes. Full Metal Alchemist, pictured to the right, also deals with war, but it's not in any way related to our history. It is not real. It is a completely fictional story, but it was remade twice as anime. It actually began as a manga, and the original series was not entirely faithful to the manga, so it was actually rebooted as Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood. Again, dealing with war, brutality, survival, and of course magical aspects, along with family and friendship. Which pretty much closes out our talk of the types of resources, the different anime, manga, live action films, light novels. And I just want to take a few minutes to get into the censorship, as this is something we're exporting into our country. There have been a few cases, and the one I have up on the screen is actually, if you're not familiar with the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, definitely check them out. They actually picked up this particular case when actually there was a gentleman stopped crossing the border by Canadian customs for having what they deemed to be child pornography, and was actually just fairly innocuous anime and manga images. And they were charging him with child pornography, and he faced pretty steep fines and the perspective of becoming a sex offender based on drawn images. So it was a pretty frightening case to watch, because you don't think, as you're exploring what seems to be innocuous animated stories, lighthearted tales, and even pretty mature storylines, as pornographic. But again, it just kind of drives home some of the misunderstanding. And it struck me when I went to see Your Name, sitting there watching the previews, all of the previews in the theater were geared towards children's movies. So there's kind of a disconnect between, is it for kids, is it pornographic, is it weird images? And that's still pretty pervasive out there in society. Thankfully, it's loosening a little bit in the import of anime and manga. For instance, when Sailor Moon came out in the mid-90s, the same-sex couples within those stories were changed. So the female same-sex couple, they became cousins. And the male same-sex couple, there was actually a male that was effeminate looking enough that they were able to change the dub and get a female voice actor to portray the male character. Another interesting aspect of the 90s series of Sailor Moons is the end of the series, they had almost public service announcements talking about good hygiene and behavior. All of that has been eliminated in the new release and the reboot of the Sailor Moon anime that is coming out presently. Pokemon is another example of censorship, wherein they actually changed the rice balls to donuts in the dub, so you can clearly see characters holding Japanese food or rice balls, and then they're referred to as donuts. And the company that produced the dubs actually said it was their intention to Americanize the storylines to make it more relatable. And there is something to be said for having to adjust for this when you're importing, because you want it to be appealing enough that they can broadcast it, because it is quite expensive to acquire the properties. But you also want to be faithful to the fans that recognize that you are changing the original source material. So generally they might censor on television and broadcast release, and then release the uncensored version to DVD. So resources for understanding what's out there. I didn't recommend too many books and articles for you to read, but I did try to gather a couple of different websites you might navigate to and check out periodically to get a sense of what's coming out and what's happening. A really great resource is Anime News Network. They have tons of reviews, different articles. As you can see, they deal with anime, manga, novels, live action, industry articles, polls. It's a really great resource. You can actually pretty much have a Tumblr experience on this webpage and just spend more time than you probably should looking through and examining the different materials and news out there. Another great resource, especially for librarians, is Barnes & Noble's Sci-Fi and Fantasy blog, which specifically has a manga section. The interview that I was referencing before from New York Comic Con is actually cataloged here, and they really take a more librarian-esque take to reviews that are posted on this website. Another excellent resource is Shonen Jump magazine, which is actually put out by Viz Media, and is, as indicated by the name, it's generally targeting that age group we talked about before of males ages 8 to 18. Again, hero anime, fighting, sports, male friendships, action and adventure. So it'll be titles like Dragon Ball Z, Death Note, Naruto, One Piece, Bleach, and the current One Punch Man. There's an equivalent for girls, in case you were worried. So Shoujo Beat has titles like Honey and Clover, Vampire Knight, and Nana. These are aimed more, again, as we talked about before, for young women. There'll be a lot of different genres in this category: fantasy, historical, science fiction, magic, and even heroism. But the overarching themes, as said before, are more romantic and emotional. Tagline, as you can see, stories from the heart. There are sparkles sometimes in these manga. So romantic stories, relationships, and sensitive characters are basically the makeup of the manga for girls. I didn't touch too much on outreach here, but beyond just having reading groups and speaker series if you're in an academic environment, I think when it comes to anime and manga, one of the best ways that you can reach out is sometimes just making it known that you're anime or manga friendly. A quick anecdotal example is I tend to put, when I go to different cons and deal with Viz and Funimation and some of the vendors, I tend to pick up extras of posters and bookmarks and the like when I can, and I usually put these up on the wall in my office. And in the open reading room where I have an office with a window, I recently, when I was constructing this talk, had a student pass by and stop and back up, and he started to move on, and then he stopped again. So being the shy but friendly librarian that I am, I kind of waved him in and I said, "Did you have a question?" And he sat down, and I'm not going to articulate this in the same nice way that he did, but he said, "I've always been curious about this office when I walk by, and I guess I tend to miss you. But I just wanted to ask about all the posters on the walls. I think they're really great." And he said, it's what I think it is. He said, "It's kind of like an invitation to come and talk about these." And in my head, I was doing a little happy dance because I said, in a way, yes, of course I have these here because it's my personal interest. But it is sort of a token to and a nod to say, hey, I am willing to talk about this. And it's a great lead-in, especially on an academic campus where I am, for students that maybe are not comfortable approaching librarians. It's a lead-in not just to this topic, but it gives you an opportunity to then talk about what you might help them with outside in academics. So for us, it's information literacy. In a public library, it might just be introducing them to resources they didn't know about. For example, an anime that they might be interested in, they may not know comes with a light novel or a manga. Vice versa, that's a great resource for you when you're dealing with collection development and trying to figure out what's out there. Your patrons are great resources for telling you about different series, new series, popular series, and titles. So that pretty much ends our whirlwind tour. I do have some references to the articles I was mentioning before, and I'm going to put my contact information up. Feel free to email me. I know we covered a lot. I feel like this was an information literacy course where I just threw the whole world at you and just said have fun. But I'm here. We can ask questions, and I think we have about 15 minutes left. And if anyone has questions or wants to talk.
We'll give everyone some time to type their last-minute questions in. And I want to thank Claudia again for this presentation.
Thanks, Kelsey.
No problem. So Claudia, if there's anything else that you have to say for us, anything else you want to touch on, feel free.
Anything else I want to touch on? I think I kind of covered everything I wanted to say. Really, it's just, I guess, about deciding what you want to collect, what's most appropriate for your patrons, because in the manga that I mentioned before, things like Bleach and One Piece, Naruto, they're massive, massive manga series that also produced 200 and 300 episode. In the case of One Piece, it's ongoing, and I think they're up to 700 episodes. So these might not necessarily be feasible for you to collect at your libraries and share with your patrons, but what is feasible are the films, some of the light novels, and those stories that are more essential to core collections. Again, the bigger shonen titles are a bit more unwieldy to incorporate into collections, but trying to acquire films, light novels, and some of the shorter manga is definitely something that is doable no matter the size and scale of your library.
Okay. Jenna asked if you have any suggestions for activities that can be done at her anime manga club. She's been running it for 2 years at a public library for teens, and she's slowly running out of ideas.
Running out of ideas? Oh no. The trouble is I'm not a public librarian, so the ideas I tend to come up with always tend to have a bit of an academic twist to them. And beyond screenings and sort of group reads, I don't know what, you said it's teens, so I've seen in Japan they do a lot of group projects to draw manga panels, and I don't know if you're more of a story focus versus an artistic focus, but that might be something you could consider. And don't ever underestimate the power of contacting Viz, Funimation, and the vendors, the licensors themselves, because there have been opportunities at my prior institution. One of the licensors actually offered to send me part of a series before it had even aired if I wanted to do a small screening. So sometimes contacting them directly, they're more than willing to do outreach and contribute to activities.
All right. If nobody else has any questions, we can probably conclude the webinar for today. I'd like to thank everybody for coming, and especially Claudia, and I just want to tell everyone to enjoy the rest of their day.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone.